So hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Liz from the Divinity Foundation. So Community Conversations is an opportunity for you, the community, to hear from contributors within the internet computer ecosystem and have the opportunity to ask them questions live. So today, very excitingly, we have our very own Divinity Foundation researcher, Lara Schmidt, who's going to go over the Service Nervous System, or SNS, which would allow developers to create an NNS-like permissionless tokenized governance system with its own token ledger for dApps and services. So don't want to steal any more of your thunder, Laura. Feel free to.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Liz, and welcome everyone also from my side to this talk on the service nervous system. So before I dive into the topic, let me first very briefly recap some of the things about the internet computer. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So on a high level, the internet computer consists of multiple subnets, and each of those subnets is run by a set of machine nodes that all talk to each other and then achieve consensus together. And each subnet then hosts so-called canisters, which are stateful programs that, for example, realize decentralized applications, or we also call them dApps. And these canisters can then communicate with each other. And in particular, also canisters in one subnet can communicate with canisters in other subnets. And the cool feature about the internet computer is that we can extend it with more subnets, and we can also add more nodes to the existing subnets. And to actually control all of this, so which nodes are in which subnets and how should they be added and deleted, the internet computer is governed by an open permissionless governance system, which is called the Network Nervous System, or NNS for short. So everyone can participate in this governance and contribute to decisions. So for example, whether a node should be added to a subnet. And if these decisions are then made, they are then automatically executed on chain. And this is what makes the internet computer fully adoptable. So the NNS itself is also just realized by a set of canisters that are hosted on a special subnet. And let's now very quickly look at some of these NNS canisters again. I'll just focus on those three because those are the ones that will be relevant for the rest of the talk. So first, the so-called governance canister on the NNS stores two things. It stores neurons, and the neurons are basically just consist of staked tokens that determine who is allowed to participate in governance. And everyone can actually participate by just purchasing tokens and stake them in neurons, and therefore become a neuron holder and participate. And the other thing the governance canister stores are proposals. So proposals are basically suggestions how the internet computer should be evolved. For example, that a new subnet should be created or a node should be added to a subnet. And these proposals can be made by any neuron holder, and all the neuron holders can then also collectively make decisions whether the proposal should be adopted. Next, we have the ledger canister. And the ledger canister first stores the ICP utility token accounts. So that means that for all of the principals, it stores how many tokens this principal owns. And by principals in this context, I just mean an identity by which a user is authenticated on the internet computer. And on the slide here, they are depicted with these kind of user icons. The other thing that the ledger stores are the transactions that have already happened. So basically, whenever a principal sends some tokens to another principal, this is tracked in these transactions. And finally, the registry canister stores the configurations of the internet computer. For example, it stores that the given subnet consists of those four nodes. All right, so let's now look how we can connect this with the topic today. So let's look at the word or the name, the network nervous system. It consists of two parts, and the nervous system part tells us that this is kind of the brain or the open governance that runs and steers changes. So, and what the part that is controlled is determined by the word network. And the NNS controls the full internet computer blockchain. So all the subnets that basically comprise the internet computer. Now, the topic of today will be the service nervous system. So we can see that it also has the words nervous system. So it also is the brains of something and an open governance that controls something. But as opposed to the NNS, the thing that is controlled is a service, or in other words, a decentralized application. Now, next we want to motivate why we want an SNS. And to actually motivate this, let's first look at the dapp on the Internet computer without an SNS. So, of course, a dapp can consist of multiple canisters and it can have a lot of developers. But to make things simple, let's just assume we have a dapp that is implemented by one canister and controlled by one dapp developer. So this developer can basically make upgrades to the code and add new features. And of course, we also have some users that are interacting with the dapp. Now, let's think a little bit about what all these different actors might want. So both the developer and the users. First, a developer wants investors. So for example, a developer might not have enough money to buy cycles to run the dapp in the beginning. So they are interested to find investors. And what we really aim for is that anyone and everywhere in the world who has a cool idea can realize such a dapp and get investors for it. Then the other thing that a developer wants is to attract users that actually use the dapp. And of course, even better would be if those users then attract even more users and we can have a network effect to drive the success of the dapp. Now, one solution to both of these things are tokens. For example, we can achieve the first goal by allowing everyone to invest, for example, by just purchasing so-called SNS tokens in exchange for cycles. And with this, the developer would then have a set of initial cycles that can be invested, for example, to run the dapp. And second, to drive the network growth, we could, for example, pay rewards in SNS tokens to, for example, early adopters or to users who interact a lot with the dapp. And the interesting thing is that those early adopters or frequent users that have tokens would then be invested in the dapp, so they would be owners of tokens. And of course, it is in their interest that the token value increases over time. And likely the token value increases if even more users use the dapp. So this has actually the effect that the early users are motivated to bring in even new users, for example, by promoting the dapp on social media and other channels. And that's why we basically achieve this network effect that we said would really drive the success of a dapp. Now, let's also look a little bit closer at what users might want. So probably they do want ownership, and we already briefly mentioned that. But another thing that they want is that the developer cannot just, for example, stop a service or update the code in an undesirable way. So in other words, they do not want a centralized party that basically controls the future of the dapp. But on the other hand, they probably still want that the dapp can be evolved. So for example, bugs can be fixed and new features can be added. And therefore, we still want some mechanism that actually allows to upgrade the dapp. And on top of that, probably also developers want to know what kind of features they usually actually want, because I guess no developer wants to spend time on features that afterwards no one will use. So for all of these reasons, we want a permissionless governance system to control the dapp as opposed to a single centralized party. This will then allow the users, the developers, and investors to collectively make decisions on what new features are best for the dapp and to generally also decide on all kinds of proposals. And very importantly, those voters should not only be invested in the dapp now, but they should also be invested in the dapp for a longer time. And therefore, voters should have staked tokens in neurons similar to the NNS, because then they want to make sure that the value of the token is still good in the future. And this in turn will incentivize them to vote in the long-term interest of the dapp. Now, by all of these things, we motivated that we need at least a governance in the ledger canister in our SNS, and that the SNS should then control the dapp. Also, taking all of these things together, we see that the underlying thing that provides a lot of the properties that we said are important for developers or users is the tokenization. So tokenization is really what the SNS provides to a dapp. And by tokenization here, I mean that we just want to introduce tokens cleverly to the dapp and the ledger and the governance, such that they create an interplay of all of these parts that both incentivizes new users and investors to join the ecosystem, but also that incentivizes the whole community to make good decisions for the dapp. So, for example, we have already briefly mentioned that a dapp may pay tokens as rewards to early adopters, which has the effect that those then have tokens on the ledger and are invested in the product. And then they are incentivized to look out for the success of the dapp by, for example, bringing in even more users and drive the network. Also, anyone who has tokens, the investors, but also these early adopters, they, of course, also want to make sure that the dapp is developed in the right direction, again, to make sure that the value of their token increases. And they can make sure that this is the case by just staking some tokens in neurons and actively participate in governance and help with those decisions. And finally, neuron holders that do participate in governance, as we have already mentioned, are long-term invested and therefore should act in the long-term interest of the dapp. So it's really all of these many parts that come together that I think have very interesting effects of this tokenization. And I'm sure we will also see lots of other applications for tokenization, for example, that are specific to a certain dapp. And I think that will be really interesting. Now, let's next also look at how these SNSs relate to the NNS. So a special thing about the SNS is that all of this is provided out of the box by the NNS. And this has multiple advantages. So the NNS provides this, and also I have to say, because this is important, it actually creates the SNSs and can update them. And the advantages of this are, for example, that now the SNS is basically an extension of the NNS. And this means, for example, that the tokens actually have a relation. So if the SNS is being really well and its canisters will burn a lot of tokens, this will burn cycles and will in turn be good for the ICP utility token. Another advantage of the SNS being provided by the NNS is that the SNS's code and upgrades are basically vetted by the NNS community, which induces some trust. Because as a user of the internet computer, either I have to anyways trust the NNS community, or if I don't want to just blindly trust them, I can, of course, stake tokens in a neuron and participate in governance myself. And then the SNS being provided as a service, of course, just also has the advantage that it's ready to use and requires no effort from a developer. And finally, the fact that all the SNSs will share a similar implementation provides a de facto standard. And this has several advantages as well. So, for example, if I'm a user of one SNS, I will also know how to interact with another SNS. But also, if I want to verify that the code of a ledger does what it should, I can verify that just in one code base rather than having to verify 100 different ledger canisters. So taking all of these things together, we then have a big picture that looks like this. We have the SNS that controls the dapp. We have the NNS that controls all the SNS canisters. And on top of that, we of course also have some parameters that can actually be changed by the SNS itself. So, for example, the SNS community could decide to make the voting period of proposals longer or to change the governance fees and so forth. And on the left side, we have all our voters. And as I already mentioned, both of these governance systems are open, so everyone can participate. But of course, there will be users that just take the NNS neurons and participate there. There will be others that just participate in the SNS, but there will also be users that will participate in both. Now, for all of this to work, the NNS also needs to keep track of what SNSs exist. And to achieve that, the registry canister in the NNS can just keep track of all the SNSs. For example, it can keep for all the SNSs that exist the name of the token that exists in the SNS, and also, of course, the dapp that the SNS controls. And although they are very similar, one difference of the SNS and the NNS canisters is that the SNS canisters burn cycles. And I try to depict this here with these boxes that basically represent the cycle accounts of the SNS canisters. And with this, we already have the high-level picture of what the SNSs could look like. And I hope that at that point, you understand what are some of the advantages of the SNSs and how they relate to the NNS. Now, let's look at how a developer that controls a dapp can get an SNS for the dapp if they want to decentralize it for all the reasons that we have already mentioned. So first of all, before that can happen, at one point, the NNS will create a lot of basically dummy or empty SNSs that are shown here on the right. So basically, these are just a selection of SNSs that don't have a specified token name yet, and they're not assigned to any dapp yet. After this is done, a developer can now make a proposal to state that they would like to assign an SNS to their dapp. So to do so, they submit in the proposal the token name of the SNS token that they would like to have, and of course the dapp to which the SNS should be assigned to. Then, as with all the proposals that we have, the NNS neuron holders can vote on this proposal, and when the proposal is adapted, the NNS would take one of these empty SNSs that we have here and assign it to the dapp. And this will happen in the following steps. So first, the NNS can add the SNS to the registry. So now the registry says that this SNS will be assigned to the given dapp, and the corresponding token will have this name, my token. And at that point, the ledger will be frozen, so no transactions in the SNS ledger are possible. And the developer can still upgrade the dapp, so the developer is still in control of the dapp, for example, if some security fixes are necessary. In the next step, we will then allocate tokens and neurons to different participants, and we will see that shortly. After this happened, this means that now the SNS is decentralized because the tokens and the neurons are distributed to different principals. And only when that is the case, we will hand over the control of the dapp from the developer to the SNS. And after all of that happened, we can now unlock the ledger and start the SNS. So let's now look at a little bit more detail how this second step could be realized. So first of all, let's talk about the initial token allocation. This is, for example, how the initial token allocation could look like. Initially, there will be 1 billion SNS tokens, and out of this 1 billion, 25% could be given to the developers of the dapp. Then 35% could be given to an SNS-controlled account. So this will mean basically that the SNS community can decide by proposals how these tokens should be spent. And finally, the last 40% will be distributed to anyone who is interested in an open and permissionless auction. And I would now like to discuss the last point in a bit more detail. So I first want to mention that this is still very much in the design phase, but I nevertheless wanted to give you a high-level idea of the ideas that we already have. And we actually, and the idea could be that this auction is actually done in a third SNS canister. So this is now a canister that does not exist in the NNS. And this canister, we just call it the auction canister. So the idea is that everyone can place a bid. As we've said, it's open and permissionless auction. And in this example, I will just assume that the SNS tokens are auctioned for cycles. So to place a bid, a principal could state how many cycles they are willing to give in total, and also what is the maximum price they are willing to pay for one SNS token. So you can also think of that as how many SNS tokens do they want to get at least for this amount of cycles that they provide. And all of the principals will then also make such bids. And after some time, there is an auction deadline. And when the deadline is over, we want to establish a single clearing price. So this means that all of these peers will actually, in the end, pay the same price for one SNS token. And for each of the principals, then the amount of tokens that they get is decided according to the bids that they make. So as a very rough idea, you can imagine that the blue user here basically offered the most cycles, and therefore now the blue user has the most tokens. And all of these distributed tokens together now comprise 40% of the initial tokens in the ledger. Another thing that happens when the auction is over and these tokens are given to the different users is that we could, for example, take these cycles and put all of them to the SNS governance canister to store them there so that they can be used by the SNS. Actually, it wouldn't be advisable to pay all of these initial tokens just in liquid tokens, because then some of the principals could just dump all their tokens right after the initialization. Therefore, it would probably be a better idea to hand out the initial tokens as a combination of neurons and liquid tokens. For example, we could give 90% of the tokens. So, and this means for each principal that gets something in the beginning, so both the developer, but also the participants of the auction, for each of them, we could give, for example, 90% of the initial tokens as a basket of neurons. And this both establishes that already in the beginning, the voters are long-term invested, but it also ensures that in the very beginning, the SNS is already decentralized, because all of these parties that participated here will be active voters right at the beginning. And then we could give the other 10% as liquid tokens to make sure that initial markets can form. So now after this last step, we will have finished basically this initial token allocation. And as we mentioned in the very beginning, we can then unlock the ledger and start the SNS. And now let's review basically what we have after this step. So we have the SNS neuron holders here on the left. And we now have a dapp that is fully controlled by these, by the governance and these neuron holders. So all the updates of the dapp are now a community decision, and all of these voters are long-term invested because they have their tokens and neurons that allow them to participate in decisions. We also have initial cycles that the SNS can spend. So, for example, the SNS voters can decide to transfer some of these cycles to the other SNS canisters or to the dapp canisters. And this provides us with this initial investment that we were talking about that really lets us fuel the canisters from the beginning. Then we also have these tokens that are held by the SNS. And they can now, for example, be used to pay early adopters or to pay users that interact a lot. So really, it's just up to the voters what they want to do with these tokens. And I think with that, we already have some of the most important tools to actually achieving those goals that we said in the beginning we have regarding tokenization. So I guess now that we have all of this, a natural question is, how do we get there? So as you probably all know, this is still very much work in progress. And the SNS feature is on the public roadmap and it is discussed in this forum. So you're all very much welcome to participate and add suggestions and ask questions there. Now, one possible way how we could realize the SNS feature is the following. We could first refactor the relevant NNS canisters to make them more generic. So we have seen that both the SNS and the NNS have a governance in the ledger canister, but now in our NNS governance, the proposals are specific to what we need. And of course, we cannot foresee what kinds of proposals the SNSs will need. And all of them will probably be very different. So therefore, we could just make the proposals more generic, such they can be applied for all kinds of problems. Then once we have that, we could reuse as much as possible of the NNS code for the SNS. And this would have several advantages. First, if we have a shared code base, of course, it's an advantage that we only have to maintain one code base rather than two. And also, not only those who actually contribute to the code, but also those who want to verify the code only have to do that in one place rather than in several. And of course, if we can reuse a lot, this might also lead to a faster feature delivery. And finally, we of course also have to design and implement new parts. So for example, the auction that we have mentioned is a feature that does not yet exist in the NNS. And also the whole process of how the SNSs will be initialized will require some changes to our current NNS. Yeah, and this is basically the idea how we could achieve these SNSs that we have seen. Right, and this already brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm now looking forward to your questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura. If you've been following the chat, there has been a flurry of commentary and we have a ton of questions today. So I've noted the questions from the chat and also in the Q&A area. So let's go ahead and get started. So first question, is SNS just a spin-off of NNS or is it a whole separate software? Will it support non-binary votings or multi-round votings? And will it use the same neuron-based voting power mechanics?
Right. So as I mentioned on the very last slide, one possible way to implement this feature, which I think has a lot of advantages, is really to reuse as much of the code as possible. This would then mean that, yes, so as much code as possible is reused. Yeah, sorry, what was the last part? Yes, and neurons, I think it was, the question was also if neurons will be used, right? And I think this will have a lot of advantages, as we have seen if we use staked tokens. This incentivizes the voters to really being committed to the dapp and actually think about the long-term implications of their votes and not just make some decisions that give them tokens now that they will then dump and do something else with them. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. So next question, is it fair to compare the SNS to a concept of a DAO or decentralized autonomous organization? A DAO is a very broad sort of technical topic with a lot of like interoperable and composable parts. Do you envision the same kind of functionality for the SNS?
So yeah, I think the broad concept, it's fair to compare that. Yes, I think one of the special things of the SNS is that it will be provided by the NNS, and we therefore have this connection that is kind of an extension of the NNS. And so if you would just implement basically your own DAO and put it on the internet computer, you might not have all these advantages. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that those things are similar.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Next question. Is it possible to use custom tokens for both, something like voting, but also running something like an ICO?
Right. So I think in the design that I presented now, let me think about it. So in the design that I presented now, we have this initial allocation that some tokens are given to the developers, some are given to some are kept by the SNS, and some will be given in an auction, right? So probably it depends on what you want to achieve in an ICO. So if you want to give your tokens to particular users, then either the developer can choose to basically spend their token and I don't know, get anything in return, right? Or all the voters of the SNS could decide to spend the SNS token in this way. But then, of course, you can also ask, if you have this auction where everyone already has a chance to get some SNS tokens, then maybe you don't need an ICO. But yeah, I hope that answers the question a little bit. So I think in the current way, there are ways to do that, but it depends on the properties that you really want to achieve, I guess.
Cool, thank you, Laura. So next question, is it one SNS per dapp or a single SNS shared by all dapps? And what if each dapp has different governance or token models?
Right, so it would be one SNS per dapp. Let me see. So here it would really have a full, sorry, I cannot show my mouse, but here on the right, there would really be a set of SNSs. And whenever a developer asks to assign an SNS to a dapp, this would really be a new SNS. So in the current design, as shown here, so there would actually be a lot of SNSs in this medium layer, and they all would have attached their own dapp, right? And so here they would share a lot of code, but they could be different in the sense that they can change their parameters differently. So basically, each SNS community can then say they want another proposal, voting duration, or other governance fees, or whatever we decide to put in these parameters can then be kind of dynamically also updated by the SNS, and can also be different in each of the SNSs.
Great, so we actually have a follow-up question. So what if my dapp is multi-canister and I want to progressively decentralize my dapp one canister at a time? How would that work with the SNS?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I said, it's a simplification that I show just one dapp here. And of course, this would also work with different dapps. Now, I guess the question is, what do you do if you already have an SNS that controls some of the canisters, and then you want to also assign the control of other canisters to this SNS? So I think we haven't kind of a detailed design for that, but I guess you could just say that now the controller of this dapp is the SNS governance canister, and if this is set in the canister, then basically this principal should have the rights to operate the code. And then I guess the SNS voters could just do that from this point on. But yeah, I'm maybe not the expert on the topic, but that's how, from the top of my head, how I could imagine that this could work.
Great, thank you, Laura. So next question, is this auction scheme for the publicly distributed SNS tokens just sort of one preconceived idea for how it might work? And if so, would the SNS provide an automated tool to orchestrate that auction process? Or is the scheme the way the IC's SNS system would allow SNS tokens to be distributed?
So it's a good question. It's, I guess, what we currently envision will be the way, but of course, we're still in the design phase, so I guess nothing is fixed. And anyways, if there are other better ideas, I guess we're open to hear that, right? And was there another? Ah, yeah. So the other question was whether there's like a provided way to interact with the auction, I guess. And so, yes, we thought the thinking was that if we provide if we actually realize such an auction canister, then we probably need at least a very basic front end to interact with it. That's the current thinking, but maybe we will not be as fancy as the NNS front end, but that's also, I guess, still, yeah, in the design phase.
Cool, very exciting. So next question, can the token supply be inflationary or does it have to be fixed at 1 billion? So for example, many dApps will want to mint new tokens to reward users for contributing to the dapp.
Right, so the current thinking is that it would actually be inflationary, very similar to the NNS, where new tokens are minted to pay rewards to those who participate in governance. So similar to the NNS, where those who participate in governance, they will get rewards, and to pay them their rewards, new tokens will be minted. And the current thinking is that this could also be done in the SNS. But note that on top of that, for paying rewards, for example, for usages in the dapp and so forth, we can also use this tokens that are from the beginning controlled by the SNS. So we can, of course, also, for example, ask for other fees in the dapp or in the SNS to then increase this account again and so forth. So yeah.
Great. So next question. So is the SNS officially on the roadmap, or is there going to be some upcoming voting proposal around it? And what are the timelines?
So it is on the public roadmap, but I think this actually implies that it will be voted on. So I think in such a motion proposal, but I'm actually not sure about the timeline. So yeah, I guess we haven't really started with that part. So yeah, I would have to say I'm not sure about the timeline, sorry.
And I know that we have some Dfinity team members on the call. So if anyone from the Dfinity team has an idea on timelines, definitely feel free to let us know in the chat.
Yes, please.
All right. So next question, is the initial token distribution configurable? For example, there's a certain percentage of tokens that goes to the developers, a certain percentage goes toward the auction, and so on and so forth.
So I think the current thinking is that it will be similar for all of the creations, but yeah, I guess this could also be made configurable.
Great. So next question, is there any sort of cost model that's associated with the SNS?
I'm not sure what you mean by cost model. So whether, yeah.
So the person who asked this can clarify in the chat, but the way in which I'm interpreting it is if I'm a developer and I want to implement the SNS as a part of my dapp, like, do we have an idea in terms of like, if that would cost X amount of cycles or something like that?
Oh, I see. I actually don't think we have determined this in detail. If we would strictly follow the design that I now have, the developer would just have to make a proposal, and this costs nothing if the proposal is adopted in the current proposal designs. But we do have some NNS governance fees for other things. So for example, for ledger transactions and so forth. So yeah, I think we don't have that fixed yet.
Okay, no worries. And I see that we have somebody from the Dfinity Foundation in the chat who clarified the question around timelines. So he is saying, as far as I know, we don't have a date set, but this is high priority. There's some details still to be fleshed out. So the most precise answer I can give right now is as soon as conveniently possible. But it's really important, I know, to everybody, and I know everyone is super excited about it. So certainly this is something that I think, assuming that the community votes yes on, we would all love to push forth sooner rather than later. Okay, so I noted down a couple of questions from the chat. So let me pull those up. Okay, so question for you, Laura. Are SNS tokens different from fungible tokens? Will SNS tokens be interoperable with the fungible token standard that is currently a proposal?
Do you know where this is currently a proposal? So I'm not actually sure about everything that is in this token standard, but I would assume we want to make sure that they are interoperable. What I do know though is that, for example, the ledger also has this Rosetta API. So this is why another reason why we want to reuse basically as much as possible from the NNS ledger. So then we also have already all of that given in the SNS ledger, right? But they should also be ready to be used in all these contexts.
All right, so the next question is an interesting one. So as people know on this call, we had a recent proposal around the integration of Bitcoin to the internet computer. So assuming that, the community also votes toward the SNS and assuming that it's implemented, can Bitcoin be integrated into the SNS process?
Wow. So I guess it depends on what we mean by integrated in the process, right? I'm thinking of how we want to integrate that into what we have talked about here. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I was just typing in the chat. This is the crossover that we never expected. Bitcoin meets SNS. I would love to see something, in that vein. So the community members here are much more creative than I am. So if anyone has any ideas on how to run with that, I think we would all love to see it. Cool. So next question. Is control administered via the canister controller? And would that make SNS-enabled dApps infinitely upgradable as you would achieve decentralized control over its upgrade?
So sorry, can you repeat that? I think I didn't get the beginning.
Oh, okay, sure thing. So is control administered via the canister controller? And would that make dApps that have SNS infinitely upgradable because you would have decentralized control over the upgrades?
So so basically, what I'm not sure what is meant by what is the control administratable, but I mean so basically the idea is that before you have an SNS, or in the slide in the very beginning, you see that we have this situation where the dapp is controlled by a developer, and after we have the SNS, the developer itself will not control the dapp, so the control will really be in the hand of the SNS. And yes, that means that basically the SNS community then decides on what upgrades are being made on the dapp, and the developer can just be one of those voters. So yes, that I guess means that it can definitely be upgraded to new things. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Cool, thank you, Laura. We're putting you in the hot seat today. You're doing a great job fielding these questions. So next question, would you suggest a dapp currently in development should keep the developer principal as the controller until they've reached a stable status, since developers hold only 25% and important app updates might get voted out. So basically, should you only adopt the SNS once an app is in a more stable sort of condition?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, but it probably really depends on what you want as a developer, right? If you're really sure that you want certain features that others might not want, then maybe you should finish the dapp first and then attach an SNS. But then again, as I already mentioned, I think it's also in the interest of a developer to actually produce or make features that the users will want, right? So then you can say, why not ask the community what they actually want? Because, I mean, in the worst case, the community could still revert all the features that they didn't want in the first place. So I'm not sure if you gain a lot by kind of pushing through the features that you want and others might not. But yeah, it's true that after this step, you will not have the full control, and yeah, the others might disagree with what you want.
Great. So next question. Can people use ICP to get SNS tokens instead of cycles? That would mean the ICP also goes to the developer's ledger account so that they can liquidate ICP to pay real-world costs.
Right. So if I understand correctly, the question is whether basically in the auction, rather than paying in cycles to get the SNS tokens, whether we could also do that in ICP tokens. So yeah, I think there it's also still a bit the question how we would want to do that. So I think the thinking was that maybe cycles are better because the prices might be less fluctuating. But yeah, we haven't actually kind of laid out all the reasons why that would be the best thing to do as opposed to using tokens.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. So next question. Will it be possible to have different upgrades for SNS, even if the NNS will upgrade or accept some proposal that the SNS community doesn't want for whatever reason?
Yeah, so I think in this big picture, it's basically the case that the NNS really decides when the SNSs are upgraded. But maybe one also has to note that the NNS community actually decides on everything on the internet computer, right? So this is not really something new. That they already kind of have this control anyways. And of course, also hopefully many of the SNS voters also maybe then wants to participate in the NNS governance and then can actually actively also participate in these decisions. But yeah, the thinking here would be that the upgrades are really done by the NNS. I'm not sure if we had the possibility to make some of them optional, but I think the problem there would also be that some of the advantages of upgrading all the SNSs together, for example, if there are bugs that need to be fixed and so forth, is that we really have one code version, right? And if we would start saying that some of the things are optional and others are not, I guess this would make this again more complicated, because then, yeah, we would have different bugs in different versions and so forth.
Great, Laura. So next question. Has any thought been given to enabling dapp governance tokens to be convertible into utility tokens, much like ICP can be converted into cycles? So if so, would the SNS enable functionality to issue new governance tokens over time to replace those burned over time per defined functions?
Okay, so the idea here would be to basically introduce something similar than what the IC has in cycles, but now on the SNS level, right? I don't think we have, at least I didn't put a lot of thought in that, no. Yeah, I guess then you would also need something similar to how cycles minting canister, right? But yeah, you might also add that outside of the SNS.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid answer. I think that community members can take it in whatever direction that they think is interesting. And if it's not possible to platform, we can all put it up to a vote. Okay, so next question. If a developer receives 25% of the tokens, then purchase 25 of the same tokens from the market, they would control the SNS, correct?
Yes, but the idea would probably be that the developers that already get 25% would not be allowed to participate in the auction. So basically, this is also kind of why this initial allocation is as it is, because now in this scenario, no one actually has 50% or even 40%. So even if the auction would only have one participant, no one would have, sorry, yeah. No, actually, I think that's not true what I said. But yeah, so sorry, the original answer was that the developer should probably not be allowed to participate in the auction.
Sorry, yeah, I think that makes sense. It's okay. It's okay. All right. So next question, Laura. Will the SNS run a liquid democracy like the NNS, or will there be an option to change the voting mechanics? So this question applies to the launch, and also things could change via NNS proposals.
Yes. That's a good question. I think that's also not necessarily fixed now, whether we should also have the same following that we have in the NNS. And I think we're more leaning towards maybe not having the following mechanism as it is now in the NNS, in the SNS. But yeah, I think it hasn't really been, again, we're still thinking about what would be the advantages. But another thing maybe that I can say in this direction is that currently it will, without following, be hard to make decisions because you always need 50% of the overall voting power to agree to a proposal to actually adopt it. So this is the current implementation in the NNS. But to actually avoid that, we want to introduce what is called wait for quiet. So this will be a new mechanism how voting works. And once we have that, then following becomes less important in the sense that if all the people that just participate in a vote agree, then we can also make decisions if we don't reach this 50% threshold. And then it might be possible to do all of that without the following.
Great, Laura. So we had a follow-up question to the previous question around, if developers get X percentage of the tokens and buy up an additional X percentage, they might control the SNS. So the follow-up question is, how would you enforce developers not purchasing their tokens on the market?
Yeah, so I think if they actually just use different principles, that's not necessarily something that we can prevent. But I think it's also not in their interest to do that, because I think ultimately the developers, they also have a stake in because they will then have a lot of tokens, right? So it's also in their interest that the token will actually increase in value over time. So I think it's not in their interest to basically act against this whole idea.
Great. And I saw that a Dfinity team member has chimed in the chat and said, Laura's proposal includes that only 10% or around 10% of tokens would be liquid at launch of the SNS and the rest are locked up in neurons. Cool. So next question, Laura, could you clarify what the SNS controlled account is again? Is it the one that gets 35% of tokens?
Yeah, so as you can also see here, this the SNS controlled account would just be so actually, as someone just reminded me, thank you, we will actually have this picture in the end, right? That the initial tokens will be distributed between neurons and tokens. But this 35%, that's not a principle that will get it. So this will just be a ledger account that is controlled by the SNS. So basically, it's pretty open what these tokens can be used for. Being SNS controlled just means that the SNS governance can send these tokens to whomever they want. So basically, the SNS community can make a proposal and say, please send these tokens to, I don't know, some principal or whatever. But the interesting use cases that we see now, for example, are to use these tokens to pay to these early adopters or to pay to users that have a lot of interaction. Maybe some possible implementation would also be to just say, we send some of these tokens to the dapp, and then we implement the dapp in such a way that certain actions are kind of automatically rewarded. Yeah, so things like this to kind of automate all of this in another canister, I guess, would also be possible. But this is just, I think, the most generic way of saying the SNS can do whatever it wants with those tokens, and the voters can really decide.
Cool, thank you, Laura. So next question, would the cycle's proceeds from the auction be burned, or would they become assets of the SNS, for example, to fund its own operation?
Yeah, definitely the latter. So yeah, that's actually, so in this picture, they're now here in the governance canister. The reason why I put them in the governance canister is just that this is the natural place to then distribute them further. So the idea would be that these are actually then kind of owned by the SNS. So they can be used, for example, for this initial, so as an initial investment, right, to, for example, send them to the dapp and actually fuel the dapp with these cycles, or also the other SNS canisters.
Great, thank you. So next question, can there be different tiers of SNS tokens for dapp? So let's say there's some kind of sports dapp and there's players and coaches and owners and fans, and they all, you know, have different kinds of SNS tokens. Is this possible?
So in the ledger as it currently is, I guess we do not differentiate between different kinds of proposals. So I think it wouldn't be possible within the ledger canister if in the design that we currently envision. But I was just thinking maybe one could add something on top of that, right? And kind of distinguish them outside of the SNS or something like that. But yeah, I think in the ledger that we currently have, there's just one kind of token, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a community member who chimed in with a suggestion saying that a multi-canister setup could enable potentially a multi-SNS setup, thereby synthetically creating the tiers that were described. See, everyone is so creative on this call.
Would be interesting to know what happens if the voters of the different communities don't agree. But yeah, I think
it's true.
An interesting idea, definitely, yeah.
Cool. So I know we were coming up on time. So final question, locking up too many tokens at launch might not be good for certain dapps since users may need these tokens to perform tasks, for example, utility tokens. Will the 90% lockup proportion be configurable?
I'm also not sure if we have kind of finalized that. I guess the thinking was mostly that it's also in the interest of the dapp that yeah, some of these tokens are actually locked, so people cannot just yeah, again, kind of dump everything after the initialization. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's really fixed.
Great. So we are at time. We had a very lively Q&A session today. So thank you, Laura, for being such a good sport with all of these questions. Thank you, community members, for tuning in and keeping things in the chat super interesting. So as I mentioned, I know this is a very, very hot topic. I'm going to make sure that this video is redistributed on YouTube by the end of the week. If you have further questions, you can definitely feel free to contact Laura or myself on Twitter. So I am at Wiz Wang, and I have retweeted some things from Laura, so you'll be able to find her there. And see you guys all at a future community conversation. Thank you so much to Laura once again.
Thank you very much, everybody.